So, good afternoon, everybody. I love the Portuguese language. I understand, I would say 80% of it, but I won't torture you by speaking it today, so I will speak English. But that is, in a way, one of the first connections that you could make between my being here and my topic today, the fact that Romania is an island of Latin-speaking languages, now part of Europe, just as Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country in between a lot of Spanish-speaking countries. So, in a way, that's part of it. Another explanation for my topic today is, on the one hand, the fact that I'm interested in, as you have heard, in American literature, that one of my subfields has to do with immigrant literature and ethnic literatures in the United States, so people who write in English, but they come from other countries. And also the fact that I myself come from a country that had quite an oppressive regime, the Ceausescu regime, so I was interested in the background of these authors as well. So the authors that I'm going to talk about today are two women who write in English, who write in the United States, who were born in the United States, but whose parents fled the United States because, fled their home countries because of the regime there. So I'm going to talk about a Dominican-American author and a Cuban-American author, Julia Alvarez and Cristina Garcia, who in various ways translate into literature their experience as immigrant writers, but also their family's experience with the regimes that they fled and the reasons that they went to the United States for. Most of these things have to do with dictatorship, or what their parents perceived as dictatorships, and the case is more complicated. The regimes that they focus upon in these two novels that I'm discussing here are the Rafael Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic and the Fidel Castro regime in Cuba. The novels that I'm talking about are debut novels, so they are the first writings of these two authors. And they present all sorts of nuances of the problems that such issues as dictatorship and dislocation can pose to the writers. I'm not going to go very much into the details because most of us know the details, or at least the major details of the two regimes that they are talking about. Still, most of the stories that appear in the novels have to do with forced emigration from the country's immigration into the United States. And they are both stories, but they are also histories, because they are rooted in the history of these specific places. On the one hand, you have Rafael Trujillo, who appears as El Jefe in most of the writings, who was trained in the United States, who went back to become commander-in-chief of his national army, and El Trujillato is something that very many Dominican writers write about. You have Julia Alvarez in our case, but you have people like Junot Diaz, for example, who also takes on this theme, and he's maybe better known because of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I placed here a couple of elements that these writers focus upon in their writing. Why? Because an extra quality of such novels, apart from their fictional qualities, has to do with trying to educate, in a way, the American majority that these writers live in as to the history of minorities, of immigrant groups in the United States. So they take elements from the backgrounds of their families and they sort of translate them for the better understanding of the American majority, who obviously cannot be as educated in all the histories around. So in terms of the Trujillato, what you can find are lots of references to the human rights abuses, and that is something that you will find throughout the novels. And a particular element that is focused upon is the Parsley Massacre, when an estimated 20,000 Haitians living on the northwestern frontier of the Dominican Republic were basically massacred overnight. That is something that I'm not sure, I didn't know about, maybe some of you didn't know about. So these novels are a very good way of learning about history, and that is part of my presentation today. And then of course there are other things that Trujillo himself was involved in, assassination attempts, abductions, and so on. So these novels in a way make you think about the past, make you rethink history, make you discover in a way the connection between the small histories and big history with a capital H, and they are very educated that way. In the case of Fidel Castro, in the case of Cristina Garcia's novel, things are a bit more complicated, because on the one hand, Trujillo seems to have been perceived generically as a very bloody dictator, while of course Fidel Castro had a lot of admirers, a lot of people who were loyal to him, and then he had people that dreaded him in all possible ways. So in this case, we have this revolutionary leader who was admired by a lot of people because he actually removed the dictatorship out of place, Fulgencio Batista's military dictatorship. And on the other hand, you have his 5 decades rule that made Cuba better and worse at the same time, out of various reasons. I listed there the fact that he was successfully reducing illiteracy, stamping out racism, improving public health care, but at the same time, the economic and political freedoms were obviously not a strong point. So the Cuban regime, as it is reflected in Cristina Garcia's novel, in a way echoes the way in which Cubans themselves were polarized and divided by the Fidel Castro regime, between the supporters and the critics, between the people who saw him as a champion of socialism, justice, and independence, and the people who saw him as a dictator, as a bloody ruler, as somebody who was involved in a lot of human rights abuses, and so on and so forth. That's why the idea of transnational trauma, the idea of living between cultures in these writings has a lot to do with pain, with suffering, but also with nostalgia. Now, in terms of hyphenation is one typical phenomenon that these novels refer to, and that is living in between the two parts of the self, the Cuban American part, the Dominican American part. The hyphen, that little thing there, is something that can unite and divide at the same time. And this is one of the main topics that you will see in such novels. So in Julia Alvarez's case, she was considered to be a pioneer of Dominican American literature. She discusses what the transnational condition is actually about. And she does that because she has the experience, the personal experience of living in a country that was new to her parents, that was partly new to herself. She translates this into the literary, the fictional experiences that her characters have. So you have a blend of autobiographical elements and fictional circumstances. What is interesting in her writing and the writing of these immigrant writers that I'm studying is the focus on how complex this self-articulation within a changing and changed social context is, and as an extra element, how gender makes that even more complicated in some of the cases. So it's politics, it's changing location, it's uprooting, and it's also gender issues in most of the cases that are focused upon. Another thing that you will find, and that the novels have in common, is this belief in a possibility of dialogue between the two sides of the hyphen. And this is what these writers are trying to do, translating history into fiction, and therefore trying to make people understand both views in a way. In terms of Cristina Garcia's novel Dreaming in Cuban, as I was saying, things are a bit more complicated, and she tries to capture that polarization of opinions that I was talking about in what Fidel Castro is concerned by focusing on 3 generations of women within the same family. Why does she do that? Because each of them has a different perception as to what Fidel Castro meant for Cuba. Why? Because the grandmother, who is the matriarch of the family, she's an admirer of Castro because he was the one who got them rid of the military dictatorship. The daughter, however, was raped by Castro's soldiers. Her husband's possessions were taken over. She had to flee Cuba and to go to the United States. And then you have the third generation, the granddaughter, who is the main voice in the novel, who is in a way the voice of reason, who is American-born, and who tries to understand why her grandmother and her mother apparently hate each other. They obviously don't hate each other, but they stand in completely opposite positions in what the history of their country is about. So memory and the way in which memory is translated into the discourses of these women, into the discourses of fiction, is central to this particular novel. Why is this interesting as literature? First of all, because you have the parallel narratives, which is an interesting kind of structure, but then because these parallel narratives reflect the way in which cultural identity is constructed. It relies upon this conjunction between memory, identification, agency, personal choice. And it also focuses, like Julia Alvarez, on the way in which the whole idea of home becomes foreign, becomes subjective in the case of people who live in between cultures. It is a construct that is based on emotional affiliation, on social determination, on all sorts of other things than just sheer physical location, geographical location, spatial location. Another thing that Garcia is questioning is the monolithical nature of truth. Does truth actually exist? Is any of these women the holder of the ultimate truth? One of them claims that Fidel Castro is basically the devil. The other one claims that she was the savior of Cuba. Can we claim that any of them is right? Can history claim it? Can fiction claim it? This is what these novels are trying to sort of put into perspective. The idea that truth with a capital T does not exist. There are as many versions of truth as many personal experiences there are. So stories, narratives, memory, history are all interconnected in these writings and in very many of the immigrant writings that I'm looking at. Fictionalizing experience is one of the major elements that you will find in such writings, and you have a quote there just to see how this works for Alvarez. She says, "I was born in New York City during my parents' first and failed stay in the United States. When I was 3 months old, my parents, both native Dominicans, decided to return to their homeland, preferring the dictatorship of Trujillo to the USA of the early 50s. Once again, my father got involved in the underground, and soon my family was in deep trouble. We left hurriedly 3 months before the founders of that underground, the Mirabal sisters, were brutally murdered by the dictatorship." Now, this is one of the major elements that Julia Alvarez includes in her novels. She makes reference to it, but she wrote an entire separate novel called In the Time of Butterflies. It has a movie version as well. It talks about the murder of the Mirabal sisters. So she weaves, in a way, the private family relationships, the individual struggles with the whole discourse of translocation and living between cultures. And she does that having this personal, intimate knowledge of what the mechanisms, the effects, the causes of Dominican immigration to the United States have to do with current day realities. From fact to fiction. This is an important title because this is what these writers are doing. They are translating their personal experiences, the experience of their families, into things that people may identify with, they may understand easily if they are placed in a fictional context, and they, in a way, have a free space where they can expose things that otherwise might not be exposed to, let's say, the mainstream media or the mainstream ways of communicating in the United States, because they are already Americanized. Talking about the wide audience appeal, these are novels that look at all sorts of things of factual reality, translating them into fiction, and I listed some of them: the circumstances of political exile, the process of adaptation to a new culture, to a newly discovered territory, the constant oscillation between homelands, between the native country and the country of adoption, the mixed sense of fear, loss, discovery, association, dissociation with or from a culture. These are all elements that come forth in immigrant literature. But what is important is that what these writers are doing is to translate these feelings into kinds of situations that are familiar to all kinds of readers, not just the immigrants. So they, in a way, have big contribution to bringing these things forth to the attention of wider audiences that can empathize, that can recognize themselves, that can, in a way, understand things that maybe they had not thought about before, were they not being put in a fictional framework. Mixed feelings. Mixed feelings are the feelings that the immigrant has in most of these novels. Why? Because on the one hand, of course, these immigrants miss their homelands. On the other hand, they left their homelands out of very clear, particular reasons, and they feel very strongly about that. So leaving the country behind may be recommendable, it may be wise, but of course, at the same time, it comes together with the fear of losing the cultural legacy, of having to integrate, assimilate, and maybe let go of the past, in a way. And you have a quote here that I thought was relevant. She comes from the mother of the girls in the Alvarez novel. She's preparing to leave for the United States, and she says she will miss the glorious light warming the inside of her skin and jeweling the trees, the grass, the lily pond beyond the hand. She thinks of her ancestors, those fair-skinned conquistadores arriving in this new world, not knowing that the goal they sought was this blazing light. And look at what they started, Laura thinks, looking up and seeing gold flash in the mouth of one of the guardias as it spread open in a scared smile. This is a passage that seems very descriptive, but this is a passage that has a lot of historical references, because it refers to the background of the family, it refers to the background of the people, it refers to the country they are fleeing, it refers to the reasons. What is interesting about these novels is that they can be read without the background. But once you have the historical background, they gain a completely different dimension, or they can offer you the ground for further reading and further understanding of history of these communities. It all has to do with redefining the self and how memory, in a way, recaptures the burdens of the past. The burdens of the past are recurrent things that appear in these novels, because obviously fleeing dictatorships is not an easy job. It's something that you carry with you. And for example, in Alvarez's novels, you see the father of the girls, who is the Central immigrant. He's a first-generation immigrant. He has been living in the United States for decades. He's completely Americanized. But still, you have a passage like this one, out of the blue. ¿Qué pasa? What's wrong? There was terror in his voice. He wakes up in the middle of the night. The same fear she had heard in the Dominican Republic before they left. They had been watched there. He was followed. They could not talk, of course, though they had whispered to each other in fear at night in the dark bed. Now in America, he was safe, a success even. His Centro de Medicina in the Bronx was thronged with the sick and the homesick yearning to go home again. But in dreams, he went back to those awful days and long nights, and his wife's screams confirmed his secret fear. They had not gotten away at all. This fear of the past, this burden of the past, this psychological investigation of what transmutation, translocation means for these immigrants, for these political exiles, is always there. The ghosts. This particular passage is a passage that refers to the Parsley Massacre. It's a very short, very brief passage. If you don't know the background, you will probably overlook it. It's about a minor character. She's a servant in the house of the grandparents. And this is just a brief way in which Alvarez introduces his history into the novel. She says, Chucha, who had worked in mommy's family forever and who had this face like someone had wrung it out after washing it to try to get so of the blackout. I mean, Chucha was super wrinkled and Haitian blue black, not Dominican café con leche black. Way back, before mommy was even born, she had just appeared at my grandfather's doorstep one night begging to be taken in. Turns out, that was the night of the massacre when Trujillo had decreed that all black Haitians on our side of the island would be executed by dawn. There's a river the bodies were finally thrown into that supposedly still runs red to this day. 50 years later, Chucha had escaped. Very brief reference, it brings about a whole history of pain and struggle and a whole embodiment of the ghost of the past in the novel. And that is why one of the major things about these immigrant writings has to do with fiction as a way of remembering, as a way of re-articulating, as a way of voicing trauma, and as a way of coping with trauma. Because just as the character in the novel, who is an immigrant daughter, has no idea what Chucha's past was about, the reader is placed in a similar position. The reader doesn't know. The reader needs to be educated. The reader needs to hear about these things. So these writers are illustrating, they are contextualizing, they are educating at the same time. New light, old wounds. That is, again, something that you find a lot in these novels. The way in which the Americanized generations look upon their native past, and the way in which there are new filters by which they understand their grandmother's stories, their mother's stories, and so on and so forth. For example, when one of the daughters looks back to when they were 5 or 6, she says, what did we kids know of all that back in those days? The height of violence for us was on the weekly television Western imported from Hollywood and dubbed clumsily in Spanish. As for the violence around us, the guards' periodic raids, the uncles whose face no longer appeared at the early holiday gatherings, we believed the slogan at station identification, God and Trujillo are taking care of you. She's all grown up now. She realizes that she has been a victim to manipulation, a victim to all sorts of discourses, a victim to other versions of truth and history, in a way. And that has to do with rupture, with rediscovery, and in a way redefining civilization. One of the essential elements that these immigrant writers are focusing upon is the way in which various generations of immigrants look at what civilization is. Sometimes that causes rupture in the family because the daughters no longer understand the parents, no longer know the past, just like the American audience doesn't understand. One of the daughters tells her father, "This is America, papi, you are not in a savage country anymore." You can imagine the conflict, you can imagine the trauma, you can imagine the intensity. She doesn't want to hurt her father. She just doesn't know because she no longer has that connection. And that is one of the things these people address, the way in which the whole idea of home, of roots, is redefined, almost unavoidably. This transnational baggage of exile, what these people carry with them, what they have to give up in a way. The stereotypes, the uprootedness, the ways in which it takes a lot of time and effort to negotiate the backgrounds, to understand the backgrounds, to retell the stories. These are novels about telling the story, telling your own truth in a way, trying to put together elements of personal history and grand history. In terms of the Cuban legacies, in Cristina Garcia's novel, things are a bit more complicated, as I said before, because the regime, Castro's regime, is presented as far more controversial, and Cuba itself is divided between the colonial past and the communist present. The protagonists are torn in their views. And for example, you have the grandmother who is devoted, completely devoted to El Líder, because she sees him as the only one who has saved her from the previous dictatorship, the only one she can trust, the only one she can follow. She is completely taken in by discourses. There is a passage saying, in the back of the plaza, flatbed trucks are accepting volunteers for the fields. There is no need to worry, a leader assures them. Work for the revolution today and tomorrow will take care of itself, right? These writers take a lot of the political propaganda, of the slogans, of the types of discourses, official discourses in their home countries, and they place them in the novels in order to see how that manages to shape minds and profiles, and how the response, the personal response, is sometimes even more important than the official discourse, because that is what tears people apart, because that is what creates drama and intensity within the family. They are very much interested in the psychology of the family. The daughter in the same novel, Lourdes, refers to the same regime as devil incarnate. That's why I called it Fear and Loathing. She believes that she has to choose historical sides, that the regime has destroyed her life. And you have a passage there in which her daughter talks about Lourdes. She says, Mom says communist the way some people say cancer, low and fierce. She reads the newspapers page by page for leftist conspiracies. Mom's views are strictly black and white. This is another thing that you find a lot in these novels. Where is the truth? Is it black? Is it white? Is it in between? Most of the times, it is in between. It has to do with putting the elements of the puzzle together. And obviously, one of the points these writers are making is that radical versions are never the way. That any kind of dictatorship is bad, that any kind of extremism is bad, that any kind of nationalism is bad, because it doesn't have to do with patriotism, it has to do with feeling superior and making others feeling inferior. And this is one of the essences, so to say, that they captures in the novel. That's why you have characters like Pilar, the granddaughter in the Cuban novel, who is the voice of reason, who tries to reconcile her Cuban and her American side, her mother and her grandmother. She tries to see what the truth is in general, to balance things out, to believe in dialogue between the past and the present, between versions of truth, between nostalgia and estrangement, as I said here. She even says, most of the days Cuba is kind of dead to me because she was never born there, she never visited before, but at the same time, every once in a while, a wave of longing will hit me, and it's all I can do, not to hijack a plane to Havana or something. Every day Cuba fades a little more inside me, my grandmother fades a little more inside me, and there's only my memory where history should be. Irreconcilable views are part of tension and divisiveness. These are other kinds of elements that these novels are educating the majority about. Strife and struggle have a lot to do with both personal and communal problems that these immigrant writers focus upon. What is interesting about the Cuban novel, about Cristina Garcia's novel, and what I think could be a very good conclusion about these two novels in terms of comparison, is the fact that both the grandmother, who admires Fidel Castro, and her daughter, who hates Fidel Castro, basically hate dictatorships. They hate the principle, they hate the system, it's just different versions that they are either attached to or opposed to. But the idea, their major idea is that violence should not exist, abuse should not exist, that these people, these kinds of regimes should not be imposed upon people. It's just where they are placed in history. It's just how they remember things. And this is the power of fiction, in a way, to see how these discourses can coexist and still not completely contradict each other. although they seem completely opposed, they can exist in the same universe and refer to a lot of issues that we encounter in our everyday life. So I just go over the slides to show you what other issues they are talking about. Loss and maladjustment, the way in which these immigrants find it hard to adjust to their new life. Militantism, how such provenance can tear families apart, not only in terms of generations, but also in terms of members. For example, the mother and the father within the same family are torn apart by their militant involvement, in a way, which is obviously not only bad for the family, it's bad for the countries in general, because they become dissociated from their essence, and that is the family, that is the mentality of the people in all sorts of ways. These writers focus on emotional responses to realities that are unique, that are specific to their context, and by doing so they, as I said, they try to sort of enlighten the American majority and people who do not know about those specific issues. And one of their major points is that literature's power, maybe major power, is to humanize inhumanity, to explain the inexplicable, to fill in the gaps that big history will never actually record. What they are talking about is not historical events, it is how historical events shape people, how they affect people personally, how people feel about them, how people react about them. These are things that you will not find in history books. You can imagine together with these writers by reading fiction, because they try to fill in the gaps and they try to teach in a different kind of way. They try to talk about movement, physical movement, but also mental movement, crossing physical borders, which also means crossing mental borders, which means dealing with stereotypes, which means dealing with cliches, which means reinventing yourself. They have to do with resistance and torment, the way in which immigrants have to deal with their past. They have to do with anarchy, and you have a lot of anarchist characters in the novel. That's why I titled it Welcome to Anarchy. One of the characters actually resorts to anarchy. She wants to blow something up, not because she's a terrorist, but because there's so much unvoiced anger and there's so much frustration. That's the only solution she can find, or she can think of at that particular point. And maybe last but not least, these novels are talking about how history can be devastating on a personal level, but also on a collective level, on a communal level, and how they are connected to memory. It is memory that decides what elements are important and what elements are not in a story. It is memory, as I said there, that discerns or obscures, vilifies or glorifies. It is how we create our connections to the past, how we perceive our connection to the past, that gives way to our story of the past, to our version of the truth, as I said before. So in these particular novels, you have a whole invitation to discover communal history, to discover immigrant history, to discover things that you may have not read about, but to do that in a, I wouldn't say pleasant way, because they are not necessarily pleasant, but in a way that is engaging both for your abilities as readers, for your creative abilities, for your capacity to imagine things, to put yourselves in the shoes of these characters, to identify with the situations, and to maybe think about things that your mainstream stereotypical imagination would probably never invite you to think about. So I would say these are the major contributions of such writers. They are representative for their communities, but they are in very many ways representative for what ethnic and immigrant American literatures are doing in the United States. Of course, I am dealing with American literature, but the United States is just an example. You have lots of other countries that are just as multicultural today, and they have immigrant communities. This is what ethnic literature can do. This is what immigrant literature can do. Reunite history, memory, personal and communal responses. I have to stop here, though I would like to talk some more. So thank you so much for being here. If you ever want to email me, that is my official email address, and it's an institutional address. And if you have any questions now or later, I'm obviously here for you. Thank you.